Hi folks, Dave Schmidt here. It's the morning of December 13th as I'm coming to you with the weekly video. First, I want to say thank you very much for tolerating me last week with no program. I'd come down with about a 12-hour flu and it had pretty laid me up and I was in bed, not much that I could do. But there wasn't a lot of new things developing. But in this past week, there has been some really good progress. A lot of you are wondering, well, what really is going on? Well, it's not that simple. It really has been a 3 steps forward and a 2 steps back process. We will get reports of progress being made, and then all of a sudden something comes up, seems to stop it, delay it, etc. And that's been going on for the last 3 and 4 months. But I did get some very, very good reports yesterday. I got reports coming directly from 2 different sources, one in Reno and one in Hong Kong, that the very high, what you call the Dragon family elders, they had been paid and had received some funds. And as you know, it was back in July, I made a trip to Hong Kong, met with one of the administrators of one of those Dragon family clans, and we had a report from him directly this morning that yes, his senior elder had been paid. Now that's all I can say at this time. But there is some progress that's being made. But here's what I want to do. A lot of you are really new to this process. And you've been asking me, well, where do I start? How do I get up to speed? So here's what I want to do. I'm going to take this video and I'm going to go on for an extensive period of time this morning. And I'm going to kind of give a whole history and background. And so that this can be a one single source video that you can turn to kind of get an overview or a recap or a larger picture of this whole process of why these currencies are here, why it's happening, where this money comes from, etc. You have to go back a couple hundred years to where we had all this gold that was here on the planet. And it always goes back to going in the late 1700s with the Rothschilds family. There has always been here on this planet gold that is beyond our comprehension. And it's always been used as a source of power and control. When you look at the history, the history of the human race on this planet Earth, for thousands of years, it's been a history of kings, monarchs, and dictators controlling the masses. And it's in the last, probably 8,000 years that they've been using money, various forms of money and debt to be able to keep control and power over the human race. There's always been some very benevolent, what we would call entities that have been involved in this process that have known that there would come a time in the history of the human race that we, through our own growth, our own evolutionary development, our own awakening process, would be ready to have a shift and change. It was in the late 1700s that the Rothschilds family were the ones that really gained predominant control of what you call the world's money supply system when they started their process of forming the banking cartels that they have. There was a famous quote in the late 1800s from the Rothschilds where they said, "Allow us to control a country's currency and we will control the country, regardless of what laws they pass." We've seen that. I was started in this process. I got started because, as many of you know, I spent 12 years in the Washington State Legislature, finishing as a state senator. And it was there that I really learned the truths about what we call the shadow world that we live in. There is a shadow government that is out there. We think that we have a democracy, but I call that the reported world. But behind it is a shadow world where there are people who have these massive amounts of money that use it to keep power and control over the world, in so many words, over the countries. They control the politics, they control the fairs, they control basically the movement of money throughout the world. About 100 years ago, there was the formation of the Federal Reserve here in the United States, and that started the movement of the central banking system. And the central banking system is what controls the world's money supply. And what we now see that almost all of the countries in the world have what is called central banking controlled money supply systems. And those central banking systems are controlled either directly or indirectly, predominantly by the Rothschilds families. Here in the United States, there's predominantly 4 families that run the Federal Reserve: the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the J.P. Morgans, and the Warburgs out of Germany. And they control the money supply. If you don't think that is certain, or you don't think that's so, all you have to do is go back and look at the economic crash that we had in 2008. This crash of the what was called the debt system, the crash of the markets. All of that was a design, what I call pump and dump. They pumped up the debt, pumped up the debt, pumped up the debt, and then crashed the system. Millions of us suffered from that. I was one of those. That was the process that began to wake me up about how much the world money supply is really controlled and manipulated. Well, Now from there, we have to go back to the benevolent side, and they have always been wanting to basically create what was called economic parity around the world. The first major step of this was the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1948. That was coming out of World War II. There was a meeting of all the major countries in the world to be able to form what we call an economic parity. This massive amount of gold, these trillions and trillions of dollars, was going to be released to predominantly help African and Asian countries, third world countries, to come up on economic parity and par with the Western countries. The reason for that is because when you no longer have what you call economic duality, economic separation, you have the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor. When you don't have that, you pretty much begin to eliminate wars, because wars are created out of economic disparity, the powerful manipulating the weak. In 1948, at the Bretton Woods Agreement, it was there that they formed the United Nations, the IMF, which is called the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank of International Settlement. All of these were to be used as tools to be able to move this money throughout the world. Well, it didn't take very long where the cabal used their manipulation, their power, and the control, and it ended up controlling that whole system. And all it did was entrench them even deeper into controlling the world's money supply and keeping this disparity of the haves and the have-nots at the country level. The next step to be able to gain control of that, what was called the Hilton Green Memorial Agreement between President Sukarno of Indonesia and President Kennedy here in the United States in 1963. Sukarno had literally trillions of dollars of gold, and he was going to work with Kennedy. And if you remember, even Kennedy at that time had created a presidential order where the United States created its own currency in contrast to the Federal Reserve notes that we have now. We know the results of that. Kennedy was assassinated because that would have ended up basically finishing off and deleting or getting rid of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve would have lost their power. And the cabal uses the Federal Reserve as their form of manipulation and power and control. It is the entity that they use to basically control the world's money supply. In 1963, when that failed, it was basically, you go back to, it was some of the most powerful and the strongest of all the world's trust. And these trusts literally have 80 to 100 zeros behind the money that they have. They were the funding sources. These very large trusts were the funding sources for basically what we call the Bretton Woods Agreement and the Hilton Green Memorial Agreement. And that was 15 years from 1948 to 1963, and both of those ended up failing, and both of those kept the cabal in power and control. At that point, they realized they were never really going to be able to make this shift and change until they would be able to neutralize the cabal. I use the term neutered, until they were neutered and they were no longer in power and control. So they started a process. They started a process of being able to want to basically come in and be able to gain control over them. They realized they were just a bunch of bankers at these very, very large trusts, and they didn't have the political control and they didn't have the military might to be able to neuter the cabal, because the cabal was using the political power and the military power through their money to do what they want and to get what they wanted. That started a shift and change. And I have met personally with one of the administrators of one of the largest trusts in the world, and he said what they did was at that point in time, they realized to create a shift, there had to be a rise of another country that could compete with the Western countries to neutralize this process. What you saw then was the rising of what was called the BRIC nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to compete with the G7 countries, which is basically Japan, United States, Canada, and the European economic powers, those powerful 7 countries. Those 7 countries are the ones that the cabal uses to be able to run the world's money supply. And there had to be a contrast to that. And it was predominantly at that time that we saw the rise of China. What happened is one of these very large trusts ended up funding the rise of China. We go back about 35 years to the late 1980s, and what we see is that China, even at that time, was still a third world country. So how does a country in 35 to 40 years come from a third world status to being one of the most powerful countries in the world, one of the strongest economies in the world, and having basically infrastructure development that makes us in the United States look like child's play? Their infrastructure development is so far beyond us. I've had the opportunity to make 3 trips into Shenzhen, China, and Shenzhen is a really interesting story. Shenzhen is the city that's across the border from Hong Kong. Shenzhen is the fastest growing and most modern city in the world. About 40 years ago, Shenzhen was basically comprised of a couple 100,000 people, of fishing and farming villagers is what it was. Today, it's a city of 16 million people. It has 2 of the 8 highest, tallest skyscrapers in the world. It is the technology center of the world. There are more PhDs in Shenzhen than anywhere else in the world. The vast majority of all of our technology items that come out of China come out of Shenzhen. You go into Shenzhen, you see a modern city, wide, complete boulevards, no traffic jams, 16 million people functioning and getting along and moving very well. BMWs and Mercedes all over the place. This is China, folks, that just 40 years ago was a third world country. How does a country progress that much, that fast in just 40 years? That is not normal economic growth. It was because of the elders. It was because basically, I should say, these trusts met with the elders and told them, we will fund you to neutralize and neuter the cabal. And in the process, we will also reward you in your country very handsomely for doing that process. So that's where you hear the story of these elders. And these elders have been working on this process now for over 30 to 35 years to come to the point of where we are today. They realized if we were going to have a good shift and change in the economic foundation of the world, not just our country. And if we were going to create economic parity, it had to come this time from the bottom up, not from the top down. They tried the top down 2 times, and both times they failed because you had too much power and control at the top. So this time, they're working it from the bottom up. They've been patient, they've been deliberate, and they've had a very good game plan. And they've been working on that game plan for over 30 years, and here we are today, ready for the shift and the change. You hear the term about elders, you hear the term about dragon families, and you also hear the terms about these very large trusts. They are the 3 predominant funding sources that are basically paying for this GCR, this shift and change. Now, where does that come to us, you and I, the everyday moms and pops? It's really important to understand when they first started this process, it was never their intention to have moms and pops be able to turn in their currencies and become very wealthy. They were going to use what were called the whales, the very super wealthy people, the very strong and progressive business people, and they were going to fund them through a process to be able to shift and change the economy and to develop a worldwide economic parity with infrastructure development all around the world. They were going to use them because they were the people that were already involved in that. They already have the businesses. They already know how to put money to work very rapidly. They know how to create and change economics and develop infrastructures all around the world. That was the original intention. As this whole dinar scenario started unfolding, maybe around 10, 12, 14 years ago, they began to realize that was a tool that they were going to be able to use. So it was, and because they still had to have a legal process of which to put this money out. So when it came down to the currencies, whether it was dinar, dong, or zim, or whichever ones, they were to be nothing but used as a vehicle to shift money and to move money. And as I said, in the beginning, they were going to use just the whales, the very large ones. But it was through a period of time, through convincing and through some conversations, they realized that was not going to be sufficient. Because to move money into the global economy, they basically have to spread it out so that it spreads the money out far and wide to be able to rehydrate the complete global banking system. If all they did was use the whales, it would be a very narrow channel of infrastructure, construction, development projects, or given money to existing what we would call 501c3 organizations. But still, a limited number of people have a limited view or a limited channel of where to disperse those funds. That became the rise of the potential of the private exchanges using the moms and pops. And those private exchanges have been organized and operating out of Reno, Nevada. They realized that they were going to need somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people as individuals, because these people would then spread it far and wide to further hydrate the global economy. When you have about 40,000 people that you're moving millions and millions of dollars through, and that the vast majority of that has to go for project funding, you spread that wealth out. You spread it out because all of a sudden, instead of now having a narrow channel, you have very broad opportunities of where to move this money to. They started it with the existing, what I call round one private exchanges. And through the process of a couple of years, they ended up only having around 20 to 25,000 people involved in these private exchanges that are ongoing right now in that process. I came into this about 3 years ago. Now, I have absolutely always believed that this has been a divine assignment for me. And for those of you that have attended my workshops, and I've had now probably over 2,000 people that have attended my workshops, you get this message loud and clear, and you understand it because you get to see the big picture of what is happening here. This all goes back to the original intention of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1948. And it's been unfolding in a step-by-step process since then. It's been unfolding so that we could shift and change, get power back from these cabal sources, and rehydrate the global economy with what we call clean money, gold-backed, asset-backed money versus the fiat money system that we have now. This fiat money system, sooner or later, they always collapse. They always do. They do not have a life of themselves of imperpetuity where they will keep going over and over. They hit a spot where they cannot grow anymore. And we are there. So many global economists have been totally surprised that we have either not have what is called a global economic collapse or massive hyperinflation. Now, part of that is there's been other reasons, and I'm not going to go into that when you can read the books about the different economists about some of the reasons why. But when we come back to where we are now, it was back in, I think it was in June or July, is that I only had around 3,500 people on my list for a private exchange of doing a round two, because I had been told from the funding sources, from the Dragon families, and from the very large trust that they were willing to fund the people on my list for what we call a round two funding. They also at the time realized that they had not hit that 30 to 40,000. So that was then that they allowed me to open up the list. Now that list has grown to about 12,500 people. I don't know when that's going to be cut off, but here's what I do know. The currencies are only used as a medium of exchange to move money. In the private exchanges, in round two, that if you're involved with me in this, what I've used a term, a 20-20-60 split. Really, it's to simplify it, it's a 20-80 split. The currencies that you will get to exchange, you will be paid at a very, very high at the sovereign rate. 20% you get to keep to yourself, and 80% is to be used for funding of projects. I've used the term humanitarian aid projects, but really it's much broader than that. The intention is funding projects to stimulate the global economy and to move the money around the world. You and I are being allowed to participate in these currency exchanges, not to make us become rich. That is not the primary purpose. The purpose is not for you and I to become more wealthy than Bill Gates overnight. That is not it at all. It is to take this money and to move it, to put it to work. But you will be rewarded very handsomely for doing that. And that is why it is important that you will need to have business plans of how you would want the 80% to be designated. Now, in round 2 funding, I've been very, very clear that nothing happens in round 2 funding until round 1 is completed. Some of you have been asking, well, can I go to Reno and exchange? No, you cannot. There are no public exchanges going on in Reno. Zippo at this time, okay? All of the private exchanges going on in Reno, they've been closed for almost a year, if not more. Yes, you will hear reports of a little bit somebody being able to do that. It's because they have deep networking with some of the organizers or the buyers or the brokers, and they can still get a few of them in, but most of those are having to come in at very, very large sums. Don't count on the fact that you and I, as an everyday mom and pop, are going to be able to go to Reno and exchange in round 1. That has been closed and closed for a long time. When round 1 is completed, it is then that about 2 months after that, I will start a round 2 process. It takes time to set up the contracts, the legal process, to make sure we've got clearance from the government entities involved, etc., and stuff like that. Remember, all of this is for one primary purpose, to fulfill the intention of the Bretton Woods Agreement. It's not about you getting rich. It's not about me getting rich. It's not about us getting to have a lot of money that we're going to set in our accounts and become multimillionaires and billionaires so that we can then basically say, I've reached the elite 1%. They will not use this money to create a new super elite wealthy 1%. If you think that's going to happen, forget it. That isn't going to be that way. Round 2 will start, as I said, about 2 months after the process. You will have to, in the private exchange, bring your currencies to a processing center. You will have to turn those over. You will have legal contracts that have been signed. You will get receipts for what you have done. And you will have a legal recourse if we are not able to fulfill that. That is why everything has to be set up with a legal process, because the last thing we want is this whole thing to be shut down in the courts. All of the 20 to 25,000 people as individuals that are involved in round 1 have had to do that. If you wish to have the very high rates, that is a process that you're going to have to allow to happen. Now, you've heard about the public exchanges. There's been a lot of information coming out on the blog sites. And let me be very clear and very direct. When I started this 3 years ago, I said always, always, always follow the money. And I have been challenging all of the blog writers for over 3 years of saying, who's paying for your exchanges at the rates that you are quoting? Somebody, somewhere, has to come up with that money. When you read these reports on these sites and the rates that they are quoting, folks, that is absolutely ludicrous and just flat out stupid. You aren't going to be able to take a Zim note into a processing center, i.e. a bank, and walk out a multimillionaire or a billionaire because you had one Zim note, but that's what they're reporting. How serious is that? And how real is that? What does that tell you about the integrity of what you're reading on these sites? It's totally ridiculous. Folks, the people, the primary funding sources, again, the elders, the dragon families, and these very, very large trusts, they're only going to release so much money into the world and to the global economy at a time. The annual gross domestic product of the United States that they produce in 1 year is only $17 trillion. And yet what's being reported on those blog sites is that that would take hundreds of quadrillions of dollars to fulfill what they are, the scenario that they are putting out there. That kind of money is not going to get released into the global economy. What does it do? It creates a super hyperinflation all around the world, and it would be worse than what we have now, because you would have a very small number of haves and then billions of have-nots. That's the scenario that it would create. They're only going to release so much money. That is why what I was told as of about 2 months ago, all of the exchanges are paying the 2080 scenario. The 20% is getting to be released, but the 80% on project funding is going to be released over a period of time so they don't flood the world with too much money. And those are all the private exchanges. Now you're talking hundreds of thousands of people who have dinar and think that they're going to be able to go into a bank and take a 25,000 dinar note that they paid about roughly $25 for, and they're going to walk out with $90,000 with each one of those because the Iraqi dinar is going to revalue at roughly $3.50. Folks, that is not going to happen. Again, what is the outcome of that scenario? The outcome of that scenario is, again, it would take hundreds of quadrillions of dollars to fund that and pay for that. And the funding sources are not going to do that. So what does that again say about all of these dinar blog writers that you're reading? It tells you something, doesn't it? Their information. They're either living in an illusionary world, they're living in a fantasy world, or they are deliberate disinformation agents. And I think it's a combined of all three of them. What we are seeing here with the masses that think that they're going to get an 800 number and they're going to be able to walk into a processing center and walk out a multimillionaire, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that have that kind of currency. What you're seeing is and experiencing is the 21st century form of a gold rush. Look at the history of gold rushes. What you have in the history, whether it was the Alaska gold rush in the 1890s or the California gold rush in the 1840s or whatever period it might be, what you always have is a few people who find the original mother lodes of gold in the earth. The word gets out and they stake their claims, and then all of a sudden it starts to spread and the masses start coming in and think they're going to find gold. And it's always a scenario of a very limited, get a lot, and the masses get very little to nothing. And they chase a dream, living in an illusionary world, thinking that they're going to get rich overnight. That's what's the scenario that is being played out in a lot of these dinar blog sites. It's a 21st century form of a gold rush. You think you can go out and you can buy a couple million dinar and you're going to walk away a multimillionaire. And you're going to wait for this 800 number to call up and go into a processing center, and within 1 to 2 hours later you're going to walk out with millions of dollars in the bank. That is the scenario that they paint, and you know that because that's the scenario in the back of your mind that you think is going to happen. That is not going to happen, folks. Now, is there going to be 800 numbers? All of my sources that are based in Reno said yes, there is. And there's a reason for that, is because they don't want hundreds of thousands of people ended up being extremely angry and almost rioting and turning into anarchy because they didn't get anything. There is very likely going to be the scenario, and I said I can't say this exactly, but I can only report it as I understand it. There's very likely going to be the scenario where the country of Iraq is going to what is called drop the 3 zeros off the currency. That means a 25,000 dinar note becomes a 25. And they will print up new currencies. They will have a 25, a 10, a 5, a 2, a 1, like that. That will correlate and correspond to the United States currencies. That means something, and then they will probably revalue their dinar around $3 to $3.50. Now, if you use $3.50, it means that 25,000 dinar note, when you drop the 3 zeros, becomes a 25, and it's worth right around $90. What does that mean? You're getting about a 300 to 350% return on your money. That's what you're getting. But in the private exchanges, they're still getting the full 25,000 note value. And they're getting 3 to 5,000% returns on their money, with 80% of it designated to humanitarian funds. That's how the scenario is going to play out. Because, see, anything different than that blows the whole world economy to smithereens with hyperinflation, because any scenario other than that is going to require quadrillions, scores, if not well over $100 quadrillion to pay for it. At the end of the day, it's always follow the money, follow the money, follow the money. Somebody's paying for this. Somebody's coming up with this money. And between those three primary sources, the elders, the dragon families, and these very large trusts, they have the money to pay for it. But they are not going to release scores of quadrillions of dollars into the global economy overnight that would only create a hyperinflation, create a new super wealthy 1%, and re-empower the cabal. That's the bottom line. You and I are having the opportunity to participate in the second round of the private exchange because they need around 35 to 40,000 individuals that they will move millions of dollars through. And as I had said, the intent is not for you and me to become super wealthy millionaires. The intent is to use us as vehicles to rehydrate the global economy through project funding. And those projects are very broad-based in their terms. I cannot give you the details of that because I won't know those details until we sign a contract. It all depends on the contract that is going to be signed with the funder. And the funder, i.e., is the buyer, the one who's going to buy all of these currencies. In the last 2 years, 2.5 years, I have made 4 trips to Hong Kong, 2 trips to Thailand, 1 trip to Europe, and 2 trips to Reno, and met with others around the United States and around the world who are all aware of this money. It's very real, and it's been there very real for a long time. In other videos, I have talked about the real source of this gold, where it all came from. You can go back to my YouTube page, and if you really want to know what to watch, look for the videos that are basically 25 minutes and longer. Those are the ones that are really what I call educational videos. Now, some of the exceptions that are now coming out more recently are the live broadcasting. If I'm putting a live broadcast on, yes, you can listen to that, but those aren't the predominantly educational videos. The educational videos are the ones that are about 20 to 25 minutes and longer. I have interviews on those that are very helpful, and all of that will help you develop the very broad-based picture of what is happening here. It's time for a shift in humanity. It's time for us as a human race to wake up, and we are waking up. We saw one of the greatest results of humanity choosing to make a shift in the recent presidential election. I'm not here necessarily saying I'm a Donald Trump supporter or a Donald Trump fan. That's not the issue. The issue is the American people decided to wake up and to reject the establishment cabal system that's been running and controlling our country and this world, and they did that through the power of the ballot box by exercising their choice. I don't know what the scenario is going to come out of that. I can't tell you that. I get information sources on both sides of it, but all I know is that right here today, we made a choice to shift and change. And it's the collective energy of us as people that create that shift and change. And that's also why that the funding sources realize they need about 35 to 40,000 people who bring in their collective energy to help set into motion a new shift and change for us in humanity. This is very, very promising. I've been involved in this for over 3 years. I believe it with everything that is within me. I've been to the funding sources. I've seen the money. I've seen the accounts. I've been able to talk with them directly. I understand where they got their money from. I can go back thousands of years and trace the history of where this all comes from, all leading up to the point of where we are today. Those of you who have attended my workshops, you understand it. You get the big picture. But it also requires a great deal of patience for us. I've said over and over again, the predominantly primary reason funds haven't been released is safety, so that the money can safely be moved to be placed into our bank accounts so that we won't lose it and so we can do what it is supposed to do, and that's put it to work. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I hope this is very helpful for you. And always, as always, I enjoy listening to your comments on the radio broadcast. I should say even the video broadcast now. And you're always feel free to send me questions through email as well. Great. Thank you very much. Love all of you. Okay. Bye-bye.